Hi, friends. As a part of this series, I wanted to give you a little bit more of an in-depth introduction to the wonderful world of burlesque. So, in case you forgot, my name is Nikki Six, also known as Heather, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through the transformative journey of burlesque, what it is, how it got here, where it came from, where it's going, and why it matters. So, you get more of an understanding of the art form that you're working within and the history behind it so that you can have a little bit more information in your brain when you're working through this medium. And I also want to talk about all of the different kinds of burlesque because when you ask somebody, oh, I saw a burlesque show, that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people because burlesque has such a long history and it's morphed into such a lot of different things. So let's talk about it. So, just to kind of wet our whistle and kind of ease us into the category, I wanted to start us off with some quotes or kind of general ideas about some of the things that people say when they talk about burlesque. So, you'll hear that burlesque is an artistic response to societal norms, similar to stand-up comedy, drag, slam poetry, and other societal commentary art-based forms. And they stem generally from the oppression of a marginalized community and the aggression against societal expectations. You'll also hear that burlesque is about reclamation and about saying that there is nothing to be ashamed of and we don't need to hate our bodies or anything associated to ourselves and our sexuality. And we can use it as a political power and as a source of being in our body and owning ourselves. And because of that, a lot of people find it empowering and a form of self-ownership. And more varying experiences of humanity that are represented on stage just means that the more inclusive we become as a community and more open-minded we become as a community. Some people say that burlesque dancing is a political and subversive and important movement because you are owning your sexuality in a world that sells everything based on your sex, but doesn't actually allow you to own it for yourself, and in fact punishes you for doing so. So the mere matter of taking any ownership over your sexuality or your sensuality or your body in any form in a world that doesn't allow you to have any is itself a politically subversive act. Some people say that just the act of including a wide range of bodies for sexualization in any form, but especially on stage, is a politically subversive act and also important in an increasingly fat-phobic society, and also in an increasingly racist and just overall we're not going in the right direction. But just again, by showing the world as it is on stage, we can just broaden the horizons of everybody else. Um, so some people say that it's still just a sexualization of bodies in a patriarchal society and that it in itself isn't in fact inherently feminist. So that is an argument that you might hear. But a counter argument could be that some people say that stripping for yourself is in fact an act of self-love and it's an act of empowering feminism because you're not performing for the gaze of an audience or for a transactional purpose. You're doing it as a form of self-expression. A lot of people are going to say, get over it. You're a stripper. You're a sex worker. There's nothing artistic about it. You're just selling your body just like everybody else. Um, the counter argument for that is that just by daring to be a burlesque dancer and fully owning your image and your persona and your sensuality and your sexuality and your storytelling and your voice and your point of view, it's political and it's subversive and it's artistic and it's important and it is in fact a highbrow form of art. Um, it is important to remember that a lot of people are going to see this art form through whatever filter that they grew up in. And a lot of people will be able to see a burlesque show or two or three and kind of break through any kind of stigmas that they have against it, but other people will not. It just depends on the human and whether or not they're willing to see beyond what is. And a lot of that has to do with intention. So a lot of this comes down to the individual performer and the individual performance. And this is where you get into conversations about the difference between stripping and the art of burlesque. And a lot of that is kind of broken down into intent and location and compensation, which we'll talk about later on. Um, and this is also where you get into a conversation about highbrow versus lowbrow art, and how that in and of itself has its roots in classism, because you have working class people performing in a working class environment, um, by kind of working class people versus in burlesque, you kind of get a more middle class type of environment and you're in a more middle class venue. Sometimes you're in a very classy venue. And again, you're being paid as an artist versus as a sales worker. So there, again, it comes down to intent, compensation, location. And we'll talk about those in depth a little bit later. Um, so today, when we think about burlesque specifically, we think about the art of the tease, but that's just what it came to be, and it's not necessarily where it started. So, if we kind of rewind a little bit in history and we look at the historical timeline of burlesque, um, it starts back in the 1500s, so it's a very long history. And as you can probably guess, because of that, in this world, the history of burlesque is classist, it's racist, it's misogynistic. It's got a lot of pitfalls, and there was a reclaiming in the 1990s that we'll talk about that addresses a lot of that. But we start with burlesque in the 1500s in Italy, and the term burlesque is first coined in Italy to describe the operetta follies that were being put on at the time. So, a folly is a review that typically has a lot of people going on in the show. It's usually got a lot of elaborate costumings going on. It's usually a variety show with topical sketches and songs and dancing and comedians, and it's just kind of a big production, but you don't really have to. Sorry. So a Folly is a review show that's like a variety show, and it's got a lot of elaborate costuming, and it involves topical sketches and songs and dancing and comedians, and it's a big pageantry kind of a show, but it's working class people putting on a working class show, and you don't necessarily have to try too hard. These people know that you've been working all day and you want to be entertained, and maybe they have something to say, but they're also going to make you laugh or something while you're at it because again it's peer to peer. So um the word burlesque comes from burlesco, which in Italian meant mockery, and it also is a derivative of burla, meaning joke, and was also kind of coined as joke of the moment. So burla. um so again, this is a low budget theater for the working classes, and frankly, its main objective was to parody or to burlesque the cultural, normal, aristocratic behavior that they could not attain and that they saw as silly or out of hand or something like that. So again, they often portrayed satires of popular plays, Shakespeare, Chaucer. They took significant political and social events and adapted them as stage vignettes. And they put in comedy and parody and caricature and ribaldry. And the early shows used comedy, music, and dance to really challenge the highbrow art and politics of the upper classes, and they often addressed social and class conflict, including gender norms, by showing women dressed as men and men dressed as women. Um, Now, because this is considered a more lowbrow form of entertainment and it was put on by a working class people, this was an affordable entertainment and it didn't make you think too hard and it made you laugh. And maybe it, had a very particular point of view, like, oh, that guy sucks. Remember when that guy passed that bill? That sucked. Yeah, we hate him. We're going to throw vegetables at him later or something like that. But again, it's very, ha ha ha, that, yeah, we're gonna, ha ha. So, the upper classes had a reason to kind of poo-poo this because it was making fun of them. So they didn't really give it much merit. But if people like it, things will persist, and people really, really liked it. And it continued on through the 1600s, where the term is now in regular use, and it's a regular entertainment genre, and it is common and it is well known, and it's pretty much everywhere on the continent. Um, Now, I think it's important to note that in the 1760s to 1840s, we have the Industrial Revolution. So, a lot of change is happening in the world in general. So, people are leaving, they're kind of isolated, smaller towns, cities are becoming larger, people are being stuck together. And they're gathering in larger numbers and they need to be entertained. And also, for the first time, some people did have regular wages. So they had pocket money or disposable income and they could use it to entertain themselves. And they did. So, entertainment continued to flourish. And this kind of jumps us forward through to the 1800s, where we see a real popularity and splurge in Victorian England. Um, for burlesque. And we also see a slow start in America in this time, but in the 1830s to 1890s, we really have a huge Victorian era burlesque heyday. So in the Victorian era, we had a stable reign. People were doing really well. They had a disposable income. They felt safe to go out and express themselves and have a good time. At this time, the burlesque circuit has joined up with the vaudevillian circuit. So, the vaudeville circuit is a theatrical genre of variety entertainment that's like a sister cousin to burlesque, but this was born in France at the end of the 19th century. And vaudeville was originally a comedy, again, without psychological or moral intentions, and was based on a comedical situation, a dramatical composition, maybe some light poetry, and interspersed with songs or ballets. So again, it's kind of a variety show. And it's a light, often comedic theatrical piece, frequently combining pantomime and dialogue and dancing and song. So again, it's a big pageantry. Again, it's a very same to burlesque. They blended very well together, which is why they joined up in the same circuits once they got kind of going. So one thing that is kind of vaudevillian in nature and still is today is what you'll see, the kind of performing animals, the more comedians and singers kind of aspect of the vaudevillian shows. But again, they worked together really well. In this time period, you do see a lot of notable like gags happening on stage or turns, and that still happens a lot in modern burlesque. And you also see kind of just the generalization of the solidification of gig culture in general. So you get one act shows that are typically less than an hour. So you go to a venue, maybe you have dinner or food or drinks or whatever, and then the show happens, and then maybe you have some food or drinks or whatever, and then you go home or whatever it is. Or maybe you have, three acts over an evening. So you have one act and a break, and then one act and a break, and one act and a break. So again, you could have drinks and fun and entertainment and drinks and fun and entertainment and drinks and fun and entertainment. So for the larger kind of local pubs, they could kind of stretch out a larger evening and entertain a larger crowd for a longer period of time. It is a fun note to note that depending on who was talking about these shows at this time, they were either known as travesties or extravaganzas. So again, a little bit of classism there. And again, you still get highlights of social and class conflict, including gender norms, and cis and patriarchal conflict is still big here. Um, In the 1840s to the 1940s, which is a little bit behind and a little bit longer to the Victorian burlesque heyday, you get the American burlesque heyday. So again, this influence of burlesque joined up with the circuits that were already working in America. So America already had a vaudevillian circuit, a minstrelsy circuit, a music hall and saloon performance scene. And burlesque just worked its way right in. But in true American fashion, we kind of worked it into our own scene and made it our own. And we took influences from all of those other genres and kind of melded it into the American style of burlesque. And at its peak in this period, we had over 200 burlesque specific clubs, and we were boasting 150 burlesque principal top star billers. And again, you saw these same kind of three-act shows. Sometimes you saw incorporations of song and dance, comedy sketches, comedians, acrobats, solo singers, magicians, ballet girls, chorus girls, along with the burlesque shows. But you also had just burlesque shows. So a lot of times you saw, 6 stripper acts, maybe one comedian or an MC or something just to kind of move things along. Um, and again, this is where you kind of see the real solidification of an MC or a barker, a master of ceremonies or a barker. And you still see that in a lot of burlesque shows today, and you'll see it in a lot of other kind of sister cousin forms of burlesque, such as drag and ballroom, etc. Um, some of the game changers in this period are a couple of shows that happened in New York. So we know that New York is an epicenter, always has been, probably always will be. And in 1866, they put on a show called The Black Crook in New York, and this show had very revealing chorus girl outfits and was very burlesque, and it made it the most popular show of the year. And producers took notice, and this really paved the way for 1868 when the British Blondes Burlesque Review came over from the UK, and it was the most popular show of the year in New York. So both of these shows skyrocketed burlesque popularity and increased its sexualization in the American genre of burlesque. Um, and burlesque did very, very well for this time. Now, the next year, as you can probably imagine, as is natural, there was a backlash in New York regarding nudity in entertainment. It's kind of important to note that at this time, a couple of other things are happening in the world as well, or in America as well specifically. So from 1861 to 1865, we had the Civil War. So there was some disruption, but we still had entertainment. People still wanted to be entertained despite all of the crazy that was happening. And also, throughout this period, we have first wave feminism. So from the 1700s to the 1900s, we have a movement where white women are saying that we're not humans, we're not property, we're not just breeding cattle, we're people with thoughts and opinions. Um, Again, this is cis white feminism only. But some of the important things that happened during this period were in 1792 when Mary Wollstonecraft published The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And that was kind of a really big launch of the feminist movement and the suffragette movement that really got things going. And in 1920, in the US, women got the right to vote. Now, I think it is important to note that the first country to give women the right to vote was New Zealand, and they gave it 30 years prior, and that kind of knocked the domino along the line, and we were kind of one of the last countries to pick up the suffragette movement and give women the right to vote, white women the right to vote. So America has always been a little bit behind the times, but all we can do is educate ourselves, and that's why we're here. So another important thing that happened during this time period is A little bit after that, let's skip ahead to the 1870s to the 1890s. Now, during this period, railroads tripled in the USA. You might have seen some television shows about it. This meant that entertainment troops could actually tour a national American tour for a full 40-week season. This meant that it could support an actual career. And at this time, these were female run shows. These were all female companies, and this was the industry norm. This was women creating shows with women for women, money being made by women for women. So this was a career in a time that women didn't really have many career opportunities. So this was a lucrative option and maybe not the most wholesome one, but certainly not the most scandalous one. So it did very, very well. Um, and it meant that financial independence was possible, and that's a huge thing. So this is a career for women, and they could have their own money and they could support themselves. So, a lot of people ran off to the circus, a lot of people ran off to the burlesque show, and a lot of other things as well, but it was certainly a good option for you if you were looking for an option. Now, in 1865 to the 1890s, again, due to its popularity, there was kind of a divergence of two types of burlesque. So you saw the kind of switch to some more family-friendly shows that were more slapstick, teasy, parody, comedy, social commentary type shows. And then you saw some more sexualized shows. So these were more scandalous humor and striptease. Um, and it's important to note that the shows that were more vaudevillian were billed to more upper class and were more acceptable and more highbrow. And the shows that were more minstrelsy or minstrel hall were more working class or lowbrow. So there's a lot of classist, racist intonations to a lot of that. That's important to remember as well. Now, in the 1870s to the 1880s, things did not slow down. In fact, they kind of continued to chug along at a steady, steady rate. And because of this, we see the institutionalization of burlesque. So we do see that the American sexualized version of burlesque is solidified as a genre, and it is a solid financial enterprise in the entertainment industry for everybody, for venues, for troops, kind of for everybody. And the sexualized shows were more profitable, but they were more increasingly riskier with the police. As we'll talk about with the increase of nudity laws. And a couple of things kind of led to that backlash. So in 1893, the cooch dance was introduced to America, and this was a modified belly dance that was introduced in the United States at the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition and was incorporated into burlesque performances immediately afterwards. It was a huge hit, and it just was a spark that blew like wildfire, and everybody kind of picked it up. And this was quickly followed by the move, the shimmy. And you might remember that that is still commonly used today, and that was introduced in the 1910s. And a modified version of the cooch dance is still incorporated into a lot of burlesque performances today. It's very similar to the bump and grind. So these two moves really solidified themselves in the American burlesque culture. This did further increase the ever increasing sexualization trend in burlesque performances in America. But that's what does well here, apparently. This leads us to 1914, which is the start of World War I. And World War I goes from 1914 to 1918. And the entertainment world, the world in general, kind of all but stops. Things start picking back up in the 1920s, as you might remember from several several shows and movies. And striptease does gradually overcome the theatrical and even the kind of song and dance vaudevillian nature of burlesque shows. And by this time, women are almost never speaking on stage anymore, despite the theatrical route. So you're not really getting so many like poems or, back and forth in between numbers. It's more performance, leave, performance, leave. Um, A couple of things were also happening in the 1920s. In the 1920s, you see a rise of the popularity in movies, and people didn't really necessarily have a lot of money. So if you had the option, you're probably going to go see the new sparkly thing, which is a movie, instead of a live show. Another thing that's happening in this time is prohibition, and prohibition goes on from 1920 to 1933. Um, it's also important to note that the Great Depression went from 1929 to 1941, and in and amongst all of this hard times, etc., we get an increasing number of obscenity and morality laws that were kind of the beginning of the end of the popularity of the genre. So if you think about going back to popular media, the modern Mrs. Maisel, where she gets arrested and a lot of her contemporaries get arrested for going against morality laws or nudity laws. Um, it's nothing new. They've been doing it in America for a really long time. So a lot of vaudevillian and burlesque performers went to Hollywood because that's where clearly the money was going. And that jump left the circuit earlier just emptier than ever. And on top of that, because of prohibition, the lack of alcohol sales, and in addition to the increased risk for performers in theaters, it just made booking burlesque shows riskier and less lucrative. So a lot of people just stopped doing it. Now, the people who did keep doing it, it did mean that you had to get creative. So some strippers demonstrated an artistic twist, elevating them to greater stardom. And this is where you have the kind of last gasp of the great burlesque stars of the Gypsy Rose Lees and the Sally Rands, etc. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, before the Great Depression, you did get a rise of lavish and highly produced follies. And it's important to note that there was a lot of production value that went into those because of the influence of Hollywood. But when the Great Depression happened, Broadway closed. So that actually meant that a lot of the smaller acts were the bigger acts. So a lot of the competition in that capacity stopped. Now, because of the increased risk, etc., we do see a rise in stock burlesque shows. So burlesque shows that are not put together and produced by performers, but these are shows produced by a venue, and they audition and hire performers to work their show, as opposed to a venue opening up their stage to a group of performers and saying, okay, we'll pay you to perform and then leave. So it's a little bit of a different power dynamic. And it's a little bit different. It's a big shift in power dynamic. And that really sets the tone for kind of what goes forward for the next several years in burlesque. Some of the follies that were produced kind of during these next couple of decades, you can see them on YouTube. They're pretty fabulous. Um, and these burlesque movie vignettes were made to try and capture this burlesque art form in a new medium because, again, Hollywood was the new hip thing. This is what everybody was doing. So they tried to do that. But unfortunately, it wasn't very successful. Now, a lot of people believe that this is what created the classic Hollywood bombshell character. Um, and something that set the standards of femininity up for years to come, which is something that burlesque will address in the coming years, and we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's something to talk about. Um, And this brings us forward to 1939 to 1945. So this is World War II. Um, this time, the entertainment world doesn't stop, but it is under attack just like everything else. The rise of fascism hits everything, including entertainment. Um, in the 1930s to the 1940s, you do see an increased social crackdown on burlesque shows. And this just starts a slow decline in the popularity of the genre. Specifically, in New York, Mayor LaGuardia clamped down on burlesque, effectively putting it out of business. He really made his no crime, no burlesque kind of campaign. And because New York is such a social hub, things kind of dwindled from there. There were some kind of outliers that stayed alive for a little bit longer, but again, with the death of the big dog, kind of everything dwindled after that. And because of that, again, things had to shift and get creative to stay alive. So this is bringing us to the 1940s to the 1950s, which is where we get the beginnings of girly shows. So as audiences dwindled, sex appeal was relied upon to bring in more crowds, and the increased sexualization of the genre in America continues. So this is essentially the birth of strip clubs as we know it in America. Um, and these continue through to the 1950s to the 1970s. So it's really a decline of burlesque in general. Um, so, in addition to the increased sexualization, these clubs are now relying on women's bodies to draw crowds, and there's a focus on stripping versus artistries. And in addition to that, dancers are encouraged to spend time with the audience and boost the liquor sales. And capitalist America took this model and ran with it because why would I just book performers to, be celebrated and then leave when I can employ sales associates to increase liquor sales and keep people here longer and to bring people in? So it does very well in America, and it kind of blindsides burlesque and just kind of fizzles it out, and strip clubs become the norm, and burlesque is just not common anymore. This does bring us to second wave feminism, and second wave feminism builds on first wave feminism in that it challenges the women's role in society. So thank you for acknowledging that we're human, but now that we are acknowledged as human, what does that mean in regards to our role in society? So it was very much inspired by the civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War. And activists very much focused on the institutions that held women back, such as banks. Why can't we have our own bank accounts? Colleges and universities. Why can't I study to be a doctor? Etc. You also started to see traditional gender and family roles getting questioned for the first time, really out loud. And you also start to hear a lot of racial and queer theory becoming a lot more established. Um, I think it is important to note that a lot of people felt very conflicted in this era and they had to kind of choose a struggle, as it were. So they didn't feel like they could kind of fight all of the fights that they had a dog in. So, if you were a queer Black woman, you kind of had to choose a struggle. So you kind of had to go with the biggest dog. Okay, we'll get this one first, and then maybe I'll get it after that. Um, but that division and that separation worked itself into the psyche of feminism in general. So in this era, there were some major victories in the Supreme Court. We got the Equal Pay Act of 1963. We got the recently overturned Roe v. Wade, was originally instituted in 1973, and you had a couple other important and key Supreme Court cases as well. Again, fractures started at this time because no large group of people feeling this many feelings, just no large group of people in general, is any going to kind of agree on one kind of way about a kind of a thing. So From this, we had kind of three main types of feminism emerge. So we get kind of a mainstream liberal feminism, a radical feminism, and a cultural feminism. So mainstream feminism focuses on institutional reforms, which means reducing gender discrimination, giving women access to male dominated spaces, promoting equality, things that we can all get behind, what we think of as kind of traditional feminist values. Um, and then we get radical feminism. So, where we want to reshape society entirely, saying that the system is inherently patriarchal and that only a complete overhaul will bring liberation to the masses. Fan favorite for me, not necessarily for everybody. This is where we also see cultural feminism kind of start to come about, and feminism is similar to radical feminism, but they feel that there is a very specific female essence that is different from man. So this is where you see, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, Chalice versus Blade kind of things. Um, and these things kind of rumble around through society, and a lot of other things kind of go on in the world, specifically in America. And this brings us to the 1990s, which is the resurgence of things in general. A lot of things happened in the 90s. Um, a big thing that happened in the 90s was just a general reclamation. So we kind of looked around and said, what happened? Women's bodies used to be worshipped, and sculptures and oil paintings and goddesses and deities, and we used to be art, and now we're selling Carl's Jr. cheeseburgers. Like, what is happening? No. Um, so the backlash, the resurgence, the reclamation was all kind of encompassed in third wave feminism, that happened in the 90s. And this was really an era of reclaiming. So you have important cultural touchstones at this time, such as the vagina monologues, Guerrilla Girls, punk rock riot girls, Bikini Riot. A lot of people were very freely expressing their sexuality in how they spoke, how they dress, how they acted, and they did not care about what the patriarchy or what the norm was. They wanted to express themselves. And this did sometimes bewilder second wave feminists, because a lot of people just really started to reject traditional femininity. And a lot of people were like, well, we fought to be feminism. And now we're like, well, we can be whatever we want to be. So while there were a lot of ideas and mini movements that swirled around at this time, the one kind of rule that came out was that there is no rule. Hooray! A woman should be able to choose how she lives her life, just like any other human being, any other living person. You should be able to make your own choices. And there shouldn't be any prejudice or stigma attached to that. You shouldn't have any guilt for making certain choices, and you should be able to live as a free person. So this reclamation started in part as a reaction to the over-sexualization of women's bodies in the modern era in general, but it also overflowed into looking at the contemporary art of stripping, because we looked at stripping and we said, well, this isn't really what it was supposed to be. This isn't really where it came from. How did we get here? What's happening? So this brings a reclaiming of the burlesque art form for the artist, for the artistry, and really wanting to take the power dynamic away from the club owners, the producers, and really shift the money over art land that burlesque found itself in. So that is what brings us to the burlesque form that we're in today. Um, this is the birth of neo burlesque or new burlesque. And this is the revival and the updating of the traditional American style of burlesque performance. And though this is based on the traditional art of burlesque, which, as you know, is quite long and squiggly, um, the new art form of neo-burlesque really encompasses a wider range of performance styles, from classic striptease to modern dance to theatrical mini dramas to comedic mayhem to a lot of other things. So while early burlesque was primarily concerned with profit, neo-burlesque artists see themselves as committed to the art of the tease, the art of burlesque in general. So to neo-burlesque artists, burlesque is all about personal expression, self-love, and owning who you are, owning your sexuality, owning your sensuality, and not being ashamed of it, and being able to own who you are in a world that shames you just for the same thing that they use to sell everything and everyone. So again, this is where you get to the conversations about, is burlesque a politically subversive act? Yes. Um, Now, it is important to mention that burlesque is traditionally not necessarily working or performing for low to working class male audiences. A lot of neo burlesque performances tracked primarily working class women and gay men. So again, there is still classism and patriarchal filters being put on this art form, and we just have to educate ourselves around it. And although performers may still strip down to pasties and G-strings or merkins, the purpose of stripping is no longer the sole sexual gratification of the audience or for a man. Um, it is for the very clear self-expression of the performer. And because the performer is able to have that space and show that self-expression vicariously, every other person in the audience is then granted permission to take space, to be their truest selves and to express whatever intimate and vulnerable things that they themselves want to express. Maybe not on a stage, maybe in their bedroom, but it opens that conversation and it gives you that kind of pass. So again, it's important, it's political, it's subversive. Um, Striptease in neo-burlesque very specifically is often used to challenge sexual objectification, orientation, and other social taboos. And I'm happy to report that inclusivity is on the rise. And this brings us to fourth wave feminism. So that's kind of the wave of feminism that we find ourselves in today. So with the Me Too movement and with the resurgence of attacks on women's rights and gay rights and rights in general, and again with the rise of fascism in the air, many believe that we're living in a new wave of feminism, and social media activism has really propelled the movement very firmly in the forefront of every single conversation. So the fourth wave of feminism is building on third wave's emphasis on inclusivity specifically, but we're also asking hard questions about, okay, so we're allowed to be whatever we want to be. That's great. But what does empowerment mean? What does equality mean? What does freedom really mean? What do these things really account and boil down to? Um, and it's a tricky and intricate conversation. And because the burlesque art form is based in the reaction of what's going on around it, fourth wave feminism has definitely impacted burlesque. So we're seeing a lot more talk about conversations about consent, about touching between backstage, during choreography, just as much as, as an audience member and a performer. You have a lot more conversations about pay equality, and you have a larger and more open solidarity with other sex workers. So I'm happy to say that the first strip club that has a union has opened. Yay! And we're hoping for more of that to come. So that's how we got to the kind of burlesque that we perform today. It's a long and winding road. Um, but one thing that very much defines burlesque as we've been talking about it for the last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years is the storytelling aspect. So it really goes beyond stripping. It is the art of the tease, after all, darling. So burlesque is all about telling a story. It always has been. It's those theatrical roots. So it's about what is happening on stage right now. What are you, what point of view are you showing? What story are you telling? Why are you taking off your clothes if you are? Why are you watching me do this? And why is that important? What message am I sending to the audience during this performance? And what does that say about me and about society and about you and about everybody in here and about this time together as a whole and the world at large? So it's just a whole conversation. So yes, these are highly produced numbers that are heavy on choreography and musicality, but they incorporate humor and voice and point of view just as much as they do tease and striptease, which is an important part of the art. So if we're talking about striptease and burlesque, how is that different from what kind of boiled up after the 1950s with just kind of good old-fashioned stripping and strip clubs? So striptease is about making the everyday act of removing your clothing into a theatrical experience. It is an event. Storytelling is always going to be a key factor. This is about how you're taking your clothes off or not taking your clothes off. And why does that matter? This has not really as much to do with the nudity itself, but about the intention behind it. So it is generally thought of as empowering because, again, you're not stripping for the gaze of an audience or for a transactional purpose. You're stripping or not stripping or teasing as a form of self and artistic expression and with a point of view and with a voice. So you do get a lot of talk about, oh, well, it's highbrow because there's expensive costumes and pageantry and production value and choreography and storytelling, etc. And if it was just, a person in a clothes doing that on a stage, it wouldn't be the same thing. But it is because, again, the intention is different. So when we talk about burlesque, again, we said it before, we'll say it again. Motivation, location, compensation. So motivation, power dynamic, and intent. So if you're watching a performance and if the power is with the performer and not with the venue or the producer, and they're clearly expressing themselves, not expressing somebody else's point of view or being a sales associate, there's a difference and you feel it. There's also a big difference in location. So where burlesque is performed versus where stripping typically happens. A lot of times strip clubs are in industrial areas, kind of off the beaten grid, kind of away from the beaten track and out of the way and kind of dark. And a lot of times burlesque is in a bar, in a club, in a big theater, in the bright and open, on the marquee, loud and clear. So again, there are some classist undertones there. And then finally, we have compensation. So there's the difference between how strippers are paid versus how burlesque performers are paid. So burlesque performers are typically paid a just general amount. So I get this much for this much time on stage. If I'm doing just a solo, this is my amount for my solo. If I'm doing 3 numbers, this is my amount for doing 3 numbers. And the venue agrees to pay that and they pay that. More often than not, you don't get tips. You're not performing in a tip environment. In a lot of areas in America, the burlesque scene has kind of merged in with the drag scene. And so in that environment, you do very often get tips. But if it's just a burlesque club environment, there are no tips. It is just a pay per head venue. You buy a ticket, you enjoy the entertainment provided. Versus with strippers, strippers are sales associates, and which is why I'm so glad they're starting to have unions because they need them, and I've been asking for them for years. So strippers will show up to a venue and they will pay to work that evening. They are independent contractors. So a lot of times the club will say, okay, if you show up before this time, it's this much to work the club. If you show up after this time, it's even more money to work the club. So if you show up at 4, maybe you pay less. You show up at 8, you'll definitely pay more. So you pay the club out just to have the opportunity to work the club. You work the club, you work the crowd, you get your tips. After you get your tips, you then tip out everybody else in the venue. You tip out your DJ. You tip out a lot of times the manager or security. You'll tip out maybe other people who helped you out around the night. Tip, 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 tip. A lot of times at the end of the night, strippers will have paid that night to work because they did not make enough in tips on the floor that night to cover the expenses of the cost to work that evening as an independent contractor. It is very, very rare to find a strip club that will give an hourly wage. So again, power dynamic, intention, motivation, location, venue, compensation. These are all matters that differentiate burlesque from what people think of as traditional stripping. Um, Now, because burlesque is all about self-expression and because it has had such a long and extensive career, there are a lot of types of burlesque and a lot of niche types of burlesque on tops of that. So burlesque performances are as unique as the performers that give them. And depending on where in the world you see burlesque, you'll probably see a different kind of flavor of burlesque because it grew up differently everywhere. So if you go to Paris and you'll find a similar kind of vibe in Las Vegas, you get a very showgirl type of burlesque. If you go to London, you get a more theatrical type of burlesque. In Vancouver, you get a lot of very edgy, new wave BIPOC shows that are all about inclusivity and gender bending, etc. Kind of similar to New York, there's a lot of gender bending. They take a lot of inspiration from ballroom and drag culture in New York. New Orleans is very dancey, very fast. And San Francisco, it's similar to New York where it's kind of artsy, but it's also very aligned with the drag scene. Versus LA, which is very music video, vamp, pussycat dolls, look at me style of dancing. So depending on where you are, you may have a kind of different flavor of burlesque and you may vibe with a different kind of flavor. So poke around and see what kind of flavor you like and work with that. And in addition to the kind of regional themes that you'll find poking up around the world, you'll also find several different niches of burlesque. So there's classic burlesque, there's neo burlesque and cheesecake burlesque and pinup burlesque, but there's also nerdlesque and draglesque and gorelesque and boylesque and malesque and political burlesque and circus burlesque and bondage and fetish burlesque and gender queerlesque and vampalesque and comedy burlesque and historical burlesque and much, much more. So again, kind of dig around, check it out, see what other people are doing, see what jives with you, explore what jives in yourself, and then express that on stage. So burlesque can be anything, but some of the basic elements of every burlesque performance that you'll see across the board, you'll always see a larger than life character. This is always, a deity, somebody who is coming on stage and who is larger than life and should be celebrated and is letting you know, hi, I'm larger than life and I deserve to be celebrated. And you're saying, yes, you are. Yes. And that's the transaction, it's the only transactional experience that happens. Um, there's lots of attitude and stage presence. There's an essence of sexuality and sensuality. There is the art of the tease. There is, a lot of basic burlesque dance moves, the shimmy, the bump and grind, etc. You still get a lot of quiche and tongue-in-cheek humor. There's a general feeling of empowerment in the room and a very fun culture of inclusivity. So again, kind of check things out, see what jives with you, and work that into your self-expression. Um, as you're doing that, some things to keep in mind, some basic burlesque performance foundations. Stage presence. Use your character. Find out what kind of character you are, what kind of character you want to embody, who you want to kind of play with or embody or exude for this performance or for your entire career, and use that in your movements. How would this character move? How would this character interpret this movement? We're dancers. Remain lifted, remain showgirl ready, react to your environment, keep in mind spacing, etc., just as much as you are devouring your audience. Don't forget to engage your core. We're dancing for safety. It's important. I always say mind your hands, watch your pinky moments. I think a lot of power can come into the extremities, so I like to say use those and watch those and use them as you can. Um, Face. You're telling a story with your body. Your face is your most important weapon. Use it. Play in the mirror. Play with self. What can your face do? You know, how does it react? You know, what kind of facial expressions does your character exude on stage as they interpret this dance move in this moment, in this feeling? Um, Always helps to have a showgirl smile at the ready, even if you're always scowling, maybe one or two. um, Never have dead eyes. Always have intention behind your eyes. Smize. Listen to Tyra. Um, a big tip that I like to give all of my dancers is to I fuck the audience. Just I fuck them. I fuck the shit out of them. Make you just feel you. Yes. Um, Choose moments to just purposefully engage with your audience. So I don't like to wear contacts or anything on stage because it's easier for me if everybody's just a little bit fuzzy. It makes doing my job a lot easier. But I do always build in specific moments in my choreography where I say, this is a good time for me to find somebody and connect with them. And, find somebody on this end of the room at one point, find somebody in the middle end of the room at one point, find somebody on this end of the room look, somebody back there. Even if you're just looking right above their eyes and not directly in their eyes, it's important to interact with the audience to build the conversation, to build that momentum. Why though? A lot of people say, why does burlesque even matter? Why do people do it? We'll just ramble off a bunch of different options. So it's good for your physical and your mental health. Building your self-love and loving yourself as you are is difficult, but burlesque can be a really big part of your mental health routine. It's a really big part of mine. It allows you to explore different parts of yourself. It gives you a safe space to explore yourself, different aspects of yourself that you didn't necessarily want to explore or think you wanted to explore, but now you can. Isn't that fun? It allows you to explore your creativity, build your confidence, get your sexy back. It allows you to reclaim your power and empower yourself. It gives you a place to live big and be bad and not be shy or demure or to sit still and be quiet. It allows you to own who you are and inhabit who you want to be. And dance in general, but this particular form of dance is an excellent way to reclaim your body, very specifically after childbirth or, trigger warning if you've been through a physical or a sexual assault or a medical trauma or a toxic relationship, getting back in touch with the roots of who you are in your depths of your soul can be really powerful and really healing. And I can vouch for that. Um, It allows you to stick it to social beauty and societal standards. It allows you to have a voice and have a very clear point of view. It allows you to make a political statement if you should so choose. And it also allows you to be a part of a fabulous and inclusive community. And it gives you the opportunity to learn something new and challenge yourself and accepted social norms and expand your horizons and your comfort zones and to just kind of see what other people are doing and how they're living. And best of all, it allows you to have a lot of fun. So, some closing thoughts on burlesque as an idea kind of overall. Um, Burlesque is elastic, more so perhaps than any other form in theatrical entertainment, meaning that burlesque performers didn't need to perform in any certain kind of way. The performers could structure their show however they wanted to express themselves. A typical burlesque act usually includes striptease, expensive or garish costumes, and body humor, and may incorporate elements of cabaret, circus skills, aerial silk, and more. Sensuality, performance, and humor are kept in balance throughout the performance. Done properly, it can be uncomfortable to watch, even terrifying. It certainly shouldn't be about reproducing gender norms with women performing sexually and submissively for the gaze of an audience. Its origins lie in the absurd and the abstract, in perverse imitations and exaggerated effects. It is an art form which enables the artist to convey their message to an audience and in doing so encourages the potential for social change. Oftentimes, these messages are charged with politics, and more so in neo-burlesque than in traditional burlesque, but it definitely is. Burlesque has always been about feminism and about social commentary. The root definition of the word is a grotesque parody, and we've always been mocking the status quo and things that have been marginalized, whether we're talking about burlesque hundreds of years ago or burlesque today. Um, Again, burlesque is not about pleasing an audience. Um, Burlesque can be used by folks with all different types of body types, skin tones, genders, and non-genders, and it allows everybody to display their unique perspective in a way that challenges the patriarchy, dismantles systems of oppression, and open a political discourse on a broad range of topics regarding feminism, intersectionality, and social justice. This is not just a dance, but this is a particular art form where the way that cisgendered heterosexual men are raised to think that anything that is the bit of feminine is less than masculine. And we are challenging that stereotype. We are not being submissive. We are being open and honest about who we are. And it is a vulnerable thing to do to get up on stage and to basically take your clothes off in a lot of instances. Um, but if you can do that, what can't you do? Um, a lot of people before they do burlesque, they're shy, they're introverted, and it just really builds their confidence in a way that nothing else has touched them before. And it's because this art form is about building your confidence. You can't be on stage and act as a figure who is worthy of celebration and adoration if you don't believe it in yourself. So you have to believe it yourself first. And that is just pure joy for me. And in addition to that, if you're talking about inclusivity in general, the more we see confident women of all shapes and sizes and skin tones on stage It just inspires everybody else to be more comfortable in their own skin. And it just breaks down all of those societal pressures and expectations and societal norms. And it makes people feel good about themselves. Um, and quite frankly, a lot of burlesque performers are coming off stage in a lot more than you would see on the beach. So, mind your business. So, if burlesque is all about personal expression and self-love and owning it, how do you find out how you yourself want to burlesque? How do you want to express yourself? How do you want to burlesque? So, what makes you feel sexy? What makes you feel powerful? Dig into that and have some fun creating a burlesque performa that really speaks to the essence of who you are, who you want to be, and the unique power of who you want to be or what you want to project. So the fun thing about burlesque is that it allows you to create whatever feels right to you. You get to choose the moves, the music, the outfit, the persona, everything. You get to feel good and you get to really ooze into that feeling because you get to decide what feels good to you and what feels fun for you, and you get to draw your own boundaries around that. And you have the space to be whomever you want. So you don't necessarily have to be what is expected of you or what you have to be in every other aspect of your life. So maybe you have the opportunity for an hour to be somebody else. So maybe you want to, play and be a sassy temptress or a perky pussycat, or maybe you're a cowpoke with a penchant for rope play, or maybe you're a demon goddess or an alien. Um, you can play and experiment and you can be whatever you want. That's what's so great about burlesque. It's a lot like theater in that way. You get to really tap into yourself and just have a play. Um, you can be sexy and wild and defiant and fierce. You can be coy, sassy, comedic, weird. You can express your power however you want to, because owning your show is owning yourself. So think about what kind of performer you want to be. Do you want to be a classic performer? Do you want to be something a little different than that? Do you want to play with the idea of a classic performer? Do you want to be something totally different than that? Do you want to be funny? Do you want to be sexy? Do you want to be light and bubbly? Do you want to be dark and seductive? Do you want to be like political, like this is my point. Thank you. What are your personality traits? What do you want to say when you're on stage? How do you want people to feel when you're on stage? I often tell people to think about their favorite colors, their favorite animals, their favorite cocktails, their favorite cities, their favorite desserts, their favorite gemstones, their favorite flowers, um, and how they feel when they're around those things. Um, how versatile is your character is a question that I like to ask everybody. So does it change? Is your kind of point of view very, this is my point of view and it's only this? Or is your point of view kind of, well, sometimes it can be this, but sometimes it can be this, and we're a little bit flexible? Does it conform easily into group numbers if that's something that you're doing? Or is it just, this is my point of view, thank you. And that's just the way it is. Mix some things together and have a really good time. Um, when you're thinking of a character to name yourself, do your homework, make sure you're not stealing anybody else's name. When you're building your persona, do your homework, make sure you're not stealing anybody else's persona. It's perfectly fine to be inspired by somebody and to want to be like somebody and to really take that as inspiration versus completely knocking somebody off and stealing their vibe or their name or their moves or, whatever it is. So it is a creative experiment. Be creative and be respectful to the other creatives in the space. Um, to end, I just want to end with kind of a mantra that I created for when I'm working with a group of people and when we enter a performing space. So when you enter a space and you're getting ready to do a performance, and if you're a little bit nervous or if you just want to like stand in your power, you can recite this mantra. You can say, we are claiming this space and everything and everyone in it as safe and as ours. We are all one. We are taking this time to own every part of ourselves, and more importantly, to celebrate every aspect of ourselves. We are actively acknowledging the fact that we are magnificent beings that are worthy of demonstrative attention, appreciation, and celebration. We are expressing ourselves unapologetically and luxuriating in our power. We are bravely and honestly demonstrating our whole selves and openly flaunting our majesty. We are larger than life. We are opening ourselves up and allowing others to realize our godlike power. And in doing so, we are allowing them to realize that they also can tap into their own godlike power if only they allow themselves to do so. And never forget, you are everything, and people should fucking know. So go out there and show them what you've got.